Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for coming today. I'm excited to talk to you about marijuana and what you should know, hence the title of this presentation. I speak fairly regularly on the subject, and I do it because what I've noticed is that there's a pretty significant gap between what we read in addiction medicine journals, what we see coming out from official government publications, and what I hear coming out of the mouths of kids in my programs. I'm a hospital administrator. I oversee outpatient and a detox clinic. And what I hear them talking about, their parents talking about, what we hear in the media, it doesn't always match up. And so my hope for you today is that you'll learn something that you didn't already know. You'll get some context. I really like to look at these concepts in a very holistic sort of way. And at the end, hopefully we'll also have some time for some questions. My email is down here at the bottom of the first slide. I like to be very transparent about where I get my data from, where I'm getting my sources. So if you'd like these slides, if you'd like any of the research articles that I mentioned, please reach out. I'm happy to provide them for you. Also, feel free to connect or follow me on LinkedIn. I post a lot of new news as it comes in. I really try to stay updated on these topics, and so I push it out. I push it out there as well. But all right, so that being said, let's dive in. We are in the middle of a changing landscape right now as far as the relationship of the general population to drugs in general. This is where things started if you go back a few decades in terms of like just say no to drugs and this is your brain on drugs, crack is whack. This was really very pervasive in just the common media and what kids were encountering. What we're starting to see though now is that things are shifting, and we're starting to see ideas and images like this, where prescription drugs kill more people than motor vehicle accidents, and marijuana, no recorded case of death by cannabis overdose ever, which is actually untrue, but sounds really nice when you juxtapose it that way. There's been a real push towards these ideas that natural remedies are better. And almost as if modern medicine isn't to be trusted, or that medicine almost has like a bad connotation right now, that it's synthetic or artificial in some way. And it's not to say that natural remedies are a bad idea, but there are some cases when modern medicine is useful and actually it advances our health in ways that honey and turmeric and these sorts of things might not be able to do. And then another drug on the bottom there, they're talking about anxiety and stress related to marijuana, which actually anxiety is not been supported by research as a common thing to use THC for. And then kratom is another leaf-based drug that you might be hearing a lot more about in the upcoming 5 to 10 years. It's actually not regulated in any way right now, for the most part. It's not regulated federally, and it is actually an opioid. We have people in our Suboxone clinic right now because of kratom alone, and you could just buy this stuff on Amazon. It's not even regulated. So there's a lot of really gray, hazy area here. And certainly when it comes to marijuana in particular, we've seen a huge boom across the country that's really been really supported, marshaled, and pushed forward by the marijuana industry, which has got a tremendous amount of money and keeps growing and growing and growing. Just to give you a quick insight, even right now, one of the kind of like the add-ons in the current proposal for the next COVID-19 stimulus bill is opening up national banks to the marijuana industry, even though it's still a federally illegal drug, so that large institutions can make very considerable cash basically investors can invest in the marijuana industry, despite the fact that it's not even legal yet. So we're seeing a lot of movement with this. You're seeing these, again, sort of juxtapositions where like alcohol and all these negative things about alcohol, legal, marijuana, and a lot of things in there that are not true in this image. Granted, I just grabbed off the internet, but a lot of things in there that are just untrue, but many of which I've heard when I do assemblies with kids as things that they actually think are true. And this, that image also kind of leans into this idea that I hear a lot, that somehow that it's got to be like one or the other. That just because alcohol is legal means that, well, that means that we should make this other thing legal too, even though it's pretty common knowledge that 2 wrongs don't make a right. We don't necessarily have to make more problems even if one exists. and then where it's actually going. So marijuana's cultivated essentially a reputation for being a very soft drug, but it's actually gone in a very different direction in the last couple decades. I'll have a slide on that coming up soon, but if you're not familiar, down there on the bottom are different types of marijuana concentrates. So these are things called like hash, I'm sorry, hash, shatter, wax, butter, things like that. They can be very, very, very potent. If you hear of someone dabbing, we're not like talking about the dance, but like talking about dabbing with marijuana, that's what they're using, where they take a little dab of it. And just as another aside, we're also seeing this idea of vaping, right? And vaping, marijuana vapes do have flavors as well. These, though, are nicotine vape liquids that I'm showing you down here, but where this idea again of vaping is being like safer or natural, and then all of these myths, that's a whole nother talk. But where it's really being shown is that this is something that would be okay, better to do natural, when in fact, actually there's a lot of things going on in the vaping landscape, both on the nicotine and marijuana side, that are actually very, very concerning. So that's the backdrop to everything that we're going to be talking about today. But let's really dive in for a second to marijuana specifically. So first off, what is it? It is a plant with 500 chemical compounds, 100 different cannabinoids, THC and CBD being the ones that we hear the most about. THC is the one that's psychoactive and that gets you high and is addictive. CBD is not actually, and we're not going to talk too much about CBD today, but essentially it's basically an anti-inflammatory. There's very little data to support a lot of claims around CBD. It's kind of, people are like feeding it to their cat and, rubbing. It's all over the place right now. But the bottom line is that unless you take it in tremendous doses, it's not going to hurt you. Maybe it helps, maybe it doesn't. Placebos are fantastic, by the way, but it is an anti-inflammatory. So we're not going to talk too much about CBD today, because I wouldn't really say it's a chemical of concern. But it is part of the plant. Now, the reason why I'm making this distinction is that a lot of people confuse cannabinoids and cannabis when they're talking about these subjects, particularly about therapeutic use. So as an example, a lot of people think that marijuana is good for seizures, and that is a vast overgeneralization, because marijuana is not good for seizures. CBD, cannabidiol, is good for seizures. But actually, marijuana tends to be very low in CBD and very high in THC in the vast majority of the strains. Hemp, also in the cannabis family, hemp is very high in CBD and very low in THC. And so the majority of CBD products that you buy actually are derived from hemp, not from marijuana. So there's, again, when we talk about, medical marijuana, which we'll talk on in just a second, but then also in terms of what is it actually good for, it's really important that we're specific, because if we haven't tested THC for something or the whole plant, it's very different than, say, CBD. THC, though, binds to CB1 receptors in the brain, and here's where they're located. And when you see where they lie, you can understand why marijuana does what it does to your mind and to your body. So you can see down there, pull out my little spotlight here, the medulla there for nausea, vomiting suppression, some movement impairment in the cerebellum and basal ganglia, higher cognitive function impairment in the cerebral cortex, hypothalamus there on the right with appetite, creates the appetite stimulation, learning, memory, and stress concerns, and the hippocampus. And then there are some in the spinal cord, which is how it affects peripheral sensation, including pain. Although pain's a little bit of a tricky subject with this. And again, we'll talk more about that in just a few minutes. But that's how it does what it does. It is the most used recreational substance in society right now, behind alcohol and tobacco, and actually has also been that way even when it was illegal in pretty much all states. There's a number of ways to take it. So we're all probably familiar with joints and blunts where you smoke it. You can also smoke it through a bong where the smoke essentially filters up through water. Vaping has been another very recent trend with THC, and it's one that's very concerning, because the most harmful formulation of THC and THC products are those concentrates that I had pictures of in that previous slide. And previously, if you're going to use those concentrates, you had to use something that looked a lot like this. So this is an apparatus that you use to consume a concentrate. If you're not using a vape pen, you're essentially putting the concentrate down in there, and then you're heating it up with essentially, oftentimes it's a butane torch. So you put on something called a nail with a butane torch, and then you use essentially a modified bong to consume it. That is a lot more cumbersome than a vape pen. It also has the downside of, you could potentially burn yourself or, your house down. Whereas a vape pen, that's not going to happen. And so what it's done though, is it's made these really highly potent, the most dangerous way to consume this product, the most accessible, because you can buy these vape pens very easily. And I mean, if you just go online on YouTube and type in "put THC in a Juul," it'll show you how to do it. And Juuls cost virtually nothing. You can modify the pods yourself. So it's made consuming this product a lot easier than it used to be. And then of course there's the edibles. And what we're seeing here, these are pictures out of Colorado where they've got the Chronic Toast Crunch and Keef Cat bars, and putting it in all sorts of things that if you look at it, clearly is not aimed at like the 40 and up crowd, or like the pre-diabetics on the call. These aren't really aimed at you. And that's because actually 90% of all addictions start while you're a teenager. If you're going to have a problem with addiction to something before you hit age 20. And so all of these industries tend to market young. Like even if you think about like alcohol ads, like aside from maybe, the most interesting man in the world, you haven't seen anyone, over the age of 45 drinking in ads. The same thing goes for vaping. The same thing goes for marijuana, because you even though you can't necessarily like show teenagers using your product, you want to show the people they look up to, because these are all addiction for profit industries. Essentially, you get someone hooked and then they're your customer for a very long time. Cigarettes were the same way. And so if your prime market is the under 20 crowd, then you kind of have to do it a little bit obliquely. But again, you look at, your Captain Munch and you ask yourself, who's drawn to that? The answer is not older folks. It's just simply not. Now in Illinois, I assume the majority of this call is we are not allowed to directly riff off of things this way. So on the left, you couldn't see that, where that's clearly riffing off of Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Captain Crunch and things like that. But edibles on the right, although they do have to be individually packaged in different ways, certainly can occur. Gummies and brownies and cookies and things like that. There's a very high variability of concentration of this product, and how you take it and what it changes what it does to your brain. So a lot of folks are not aware. THC concentration back in Woodstock, and even as late as the mid-90s, was on average about 3 to 4%. What's happened since then, though, is as the industry has picked up, as there's been a lot of essentially selective breeding going on with these marijuana plants and how they're reproduced, the average potency got up to 12% by 2012. Right now, the average potency is about 21% THC, and you can buy flower that goes all the way up to about 30% or even more, to be honest with you. But even if we take the average of 21%, compared to Woodstock, 3 to 4%, that's essentially like one joint of today's weed is like lighting up 7 Woodstock joints at once and smoking them at the same time. And I think a lot of young people don't realize that the product that they're using is basically in a whole different league than what previous generations had access to. And even previous generations, the parents, folks who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, when they think about marijuana, they're thinking about this. They're not thinking about the concentrates that can be up to quite literally 98% pure. Again, it's a totally different thing, and what it does to your mind is also much more severe, and the consequences of using this product. So there's been a tremendous change over time with this, and even now you can buy weaker versions, or you can buy 90% concentrates. There's just such a wide range. And it is an addictive substance. So this is something I have heard that there's some controversy around this, and I really just want to take 2 minutes to set the record straight. There's no controversy about this whatsoever. It is the second most common substance that we treat in drug and alcohol rehab behind alcohol. And it's been that way for ages for adults. It's second. For young people, it's first. It's the most common substance. We've found a very clear and long history of cannabis withdrawal symptoms, both in animals and in humans. The one on top there in the top left is from 2004. It was one of the first really large literature reviews to put everything together. In a recent journal article in the New England Journal of Medicine from Nora Volkow, she's the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at NIDA, published right in there, and the CDC echoes this as well, that 9% of users overall will become addicted. 17% of those who use in adolescence, that's about 1 in 6, and 25 to 50% of daily users. Again, that's not everybody, but that's of course not, right? Not everyone who uses will become addicted, but that's a significant population. And in the DSM-5, which is kind of like our psychiatric Bible, I just took a picture of my own. Here's the whole first page of the cannabis-related disorders section. So this is not a myth. This is really not up for debate at all. I think part of why the myth persists, I think there's a few reasons. I think one is that people tend to sometimes substitute evidence, anecdote for evidence. So maybe they're looking around and being like, well, I didn't have a problem with marijuana, or I know these people and they smoke and they're okay, and they never got addicted. And so they think then that's true for everybody, when in fact that's not the case. Marijuana also is addictive like alcohol's addictive, not like heroin's addictive. So it's not like the sort of thing where you like smoke a joint or you smoke 10 times and all of a sudden you can't stop. That's not how it works. With alcohol, marijuana is the same way, where you start using it and you're using it socially, and then you're using it a lot socially, and then you're doing it on your own, and you're using it to deal with the stressors in your life and to calm down, feel good and relax. And somewhere along the way, it just becomes part of your routine. And then when you try to stop, you have these physical withdrawal symptoms. There's really no confusion that alcohol is addictive. If people are thinking that they're saying that marijuana isn't. It absolutely is. Again, absolutely no debate, particularly with the higher potency THC marijuana that we're seeing these days. It's absolutely addictive. And there's been a very well-studied detrimental impact on behavioral health and functioning, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But for now, I want to take a second to talk about medical marijuana, because this is still a thing that exists in Illinois and exists elsewhere in the country, even in the absence of recreational. So I want to explain just a little bit about the evidence we have on this, as well as where it came from. So we've had it in Illinois since 2013, but it's something that's not approved by the FDA, nor is it prescribed or dispensed like medicine. So to give you an example of things that are, we actually do have cannabinoid-based actual medicines, pharmaceuticals, what we generally, when we invoke the word medicine, what we're talking about. Marinol here on the top, that's been, we've had that since the 70s. It's used primarily for appetite stimulation. It's synthetic THC. Epidiolex down here in the bottom left, that's a plant-derived CBD pharmaceutical for a type of epilepsy. It went through FDA trials, got approved. Bottom right, Sativex, that one is a 1-to-1 oral mist for MS spasticity. And that's in the end part of FDA trials right now. These are all cannabinoid medications. These that, again, how we traditionally define it, you will be able to find none of these at a marijuana dispensary, because you get these from CVS, from Walgreens. They follow the normal channels that we use about how we do therapeutics and medicine in society. What medical marijuana is something very different. It's something where you get whatever you like from a dispensary and then use it however you want. So let me explain to you how this works for a second. So when you get a medical marijuana card, now or before recreational marijuana, you would, and I should mention for a second, there's no difference between medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. Just like there's no difference between like fun Dilaudid or like fun oxy and medical oxycontin. Like it's all actually the same stuff, because they're all addictive substances. They all can get you high. It's all the same thing. And in dispensaries right now, the only difference between having a card and not is one, price difference. So if you have a card, it's tremendously less expensive because there are fewer taxes. And then two, you can actually buy a lot more of it. So with a medical marijuana card in Illinois, you can buy 2.5 ounces of marijuana from the same location every 2 weeks, which is enough to smoke 10 joints a day. And it's been that way for a very long time. But you can buy a lot, there's very few taxes, and you can also grow plants at home if you have a medical marijuana card, which kind of defeats the purpose of quality control, but all right, they allowed it when they legalized it. But it's all the same stuff. But the way that it worked is you get a card from a doctor that says you have a condition. It explicitly doesn't say I'm recommending marijuana for this, because it has not been approved by a medical body, and that would put the doctor at greater liability. So it says you have a condition, you get your card, you pick your home dispensary. That's the other thing. You can only buy your medical marijuana from one dispensary. And then you go there, but you buy whatever you want. And so like you could have a condition like, say, epilepsy that might respond to CBD, but once you go in, you could buy a high THC flower, you could buy these extremely high THC concentrates, you could buy gummies, you could do whatever you want once you have your card. There's no control over it. So there's issues then from the medical side in terms of, are patients doing what you're asking them to, but then also from the patient side in terms of how do they know what to buy? Are they getting the right thing? Are they using it appropriately? What the equivalent of this would be with like a regular medical model is like, say you went to your doctor because you were feeling sick and they diagnosed you and they say you've got strep throat. So they certify on a card, you've got strep throat. That allows you to go to the pharmacy so that you can get some antibiotics. And so you go to the pharmacy and the pharmacist goes, okay, great. What would you like? Cephalexin, azithromycin, doxycycline? Which one? Totally up to you. Or I'll tell you what I think would be best for you. How much do you take? Up to you. When do you take it? Up to you. How long? Up to you. How do you take it? Well, you can rub it on your skin. You could eat it. You could light it on fire and smoke it. You could, this is, and then don't sell it to anybody, And so like, that's literally that's the medical marijuana model. Like that's all the control there is. People can do whatever they want, and dispensaries actually are not supposed to say medically what the substances do because that hasn't been approved. They're not actually supposed to do that, although it still happens quite often. That's not really how medicine tends to work, but we still invoke the word of medicine. And it's worth mentioning, physicians were not pushing for this. This wasn't something where like all the neurologists said like, we need to have pot for seizures, or the pain medicine docs were like, we have to have pot. It's the missing link in our treatment protocol. What happened here was that the people who grow and sell marijuana and want to make a profit off of it went to the state legislature, few or none of which who are doctors, and said, we're going to give you this list of conditions that we say that it's good for, that we think we should be able to get to the public for, and we'd like you to create an end around the FDA and create a legal outlet for a federally illegal controlled substance, because we're going to tell you that it's good for these diseases. And then the legislature, again, none of whom are physicians, said yes. And here we are. And that's actually where medical marijuana came from. Now that said, there are some therapeutic uses for cannabinoids, and here's what's been strongly validated by science: appetite stimulation, nausea suppression, some types of pain, MS spasticity. Again, this has just been tested with cannabinoids, not smoked marijuana. Short-term sleep outcomes as well. And a really good reference for this is the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine put a massive literature review out about this. If you've heard that we do need more research on marijuana, but if you've heard there's none, that's also patently untrue. There's, thousands of studies. They come out every month all the time. It's part of what I push out on my social media just so that people can see what's being published. But the NAS, the National Academy of Sciences, put out a fantastic resource on this. But this is really it. This is the list of things that are not speculative, where we've actually got good evidence for it. Despite that, however, it's been approved in Illinois, again, by the legislature, not by a medical body, for 51 different conditions. Now, it's worth mentioning that number used to sit at 40, and it sat at 40 for a very long time because whenever the industry was putting forward that they wanted more conditions added, the Department of Public Health, the medical director of Department of Public Health said, no, we're not going to add it because there's no evidence to show that it's actually treats or is good for this disorder. And so what happened then, again, back in June when recreational went through, is there was a trailer bill where the legislature, again, not the medical body, approved it for 11 more conditions because they have the ability to do that. So again, went around the medical to get these things through. Now, here's a list of the 51 conditions in the state of Illinois that you can have that allows you to get medical marijuana. It's a very long list. It's worth mentioning that marijuana is palliative for these things, which is another aspect where if you have these things, it's not necessarily that it's going to cure you in any way. It just might help with some of the symptoms. Like if you look down here at like hepatitis C, like Harvoni, pot, it's they're not even, we actually have a cure for that. but again, it's on the list. Now, where does this list come from? It's the fact that there's a theory here about how cannabinoids should work, and that's because we actually do have an endogenous cannabinoid system. So in our bodies, we produce cannabinoids endogenously inside, and so we have receptors in our brain to receive them, just like opioids. We have an endogenous opioid system. We have receptors in our body to receive those opioid neurotransmitters, which is why when we take opioids, it kills pain. And so the idea here, though, is that because our endogenous cannabinoid system is involved in so many different parts of the body, maybe we can manipulate those same receptors and get the effect that we want. The problem is that the reality of this has been incredibly hit and miss. The theory has not actually come in line with the reality. This is another article that came out that was looking at all the different states, what was on their medical marijuana list, because every state is different, because again, this isn't approved by any national medical body. And what they found was that for the vast majority of conditions, there's not enough evidence to actually support the use of medical marijuana, which is, by the way, why it's not been approved by the FDA, while certain pharmaceuticals have, right? It's not that the rules can't be followed and that if you play by the rules, marijuana or cannabinoid products can't get through. It's that there's reasons why certain things get through and others don't. Here's a list from the National Academy of Sciences study that shows where there was insufficient evidence to say whether or not it works or doesn't. And here's all the things on that list. Everything with a red dot is on the Illinois list, despite there actually not being any evidence to support it. Now, again, things do change. You'll notice here on the list, about fourth down, there's epilepsy. And now we do know that CBD specifically is good for epilepsy. And that's why we also now have an FDA-approved medication for that. But there are things, again, on there where there's really just no real evidence at all to support that it's useful. Glaucoma was another condition we heard about very early on. The American Glaucoma Society actually says itself that you shouldn't do it because it doesn't actually put, it sends your intraocular pressure essentially on a roller coaster ride, and you have to be smoking it all the time, using it all the time to get any effect. And then there's side effects to being high all the time. And I won't go too far into this, but PTSD is another one where it's honestly tragic that this made it onto the list, because the last time I checked, it was about a year ago, but twice as many people were using marijuana for PTSD than the second most common condition, which I believe is fibromyalgia. That we have real treatments for PTSD, actually, that can, I worked in the VA for 3 years. I've treated a lot of veterans and others with PTSD. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm treating people now, like actively for this. Marijuana is contraindicated. It actually moves people away from health, away from getting better. And some of the hardest people to treat are the ones who have been numbing out and who are using substances to numb out, when we could actually get them better in other ways. So again, there's huge issues with the list. So in terms of what's going on right now in our communities and decisions around local access and what's happening here in Illinois, does legalization matter in terms of health and safety consequences? Absolutely it does at the state level. We know that the reason for this is that when you have greater exposure and availability plus lower perceived risk, that leads to an increase in use. So there's always been this pivot in the drug trade, where essentially the riskier that someone thinks it is to use your product, the less likely they are to use it. So the opposite of that, the converse is, well, if people think using your substance is not a big deal, they're more likely to do it. That's why, a lot of the tropes that you'll hear coming out of young people's mouths, things like, it's just a plant, isn't it medicine anyway? It's 2020, everyone's doing it. We just legalized it, it can't be that bad. At least it's not fill in the blank, alcohol, heroin, crack. All of those things are ways of lowering perceived risk, which is great for the marijuana entrepreneurs and great if you're trying to rationalize your own actions, but is part of what leads to this increase in use. So you take that lower perceived risk and you add it to this greater exposure and availability and social norming, and that leads to this increase in use. It's worth mentioning while we're on this point, before I change this slide, that this principle also is exactly why smoking rates of tobacco have decreased, where the perceived risk of tobacco has gone way up over the years. And even as recently as the past year, we now have tobacco 21, because you make it less available, particularly to young people, fewer young people will use it. So again, it's like the drug policy, it's very, very strange if you take it on the surface that it seems to be going in two different directions. On the one hand, we're using this equation to lower the use of tobacco and nicotine, but then we're completely ignoring it in the case of THC. And one of the things that I've found, and I've been watching this and other drug issues for years now, is that when things like that don't make sense, like why does it seem like we're doing this for one addictive drug but not another? The answer is money. Honestly, the answer is money and business. And if you even, again, just do a quick internet search on marijuana investing, marijuana investors, things like the Safe or Vape Banking Acts, where they're looking to try to put as much money as they can into the industry. There's a reason why when things don't seem to match up with common sense for public health, there's always a reason. You just might not know what it is unless you look. So the increase in use and exposure leads to an increase in consequences. So a good analog for this is if you think about lead, right? When we saw that lead caused neurodegenerative illness, we took it out of everything. We took it out of our pencils and our paint and our blinds and our glass, because the more exposure the population had to lead, the more times we'd see this happen. It's not like everyone was going to get lead poisoning, just like not everyone's going to get addicted or have a negative consequence from marijuana. But population health is a very different question. In many ways, actually, the current COVID crisis maps onto this very well. Any one person might not get COVID or die from COVID, but we're practicing social distancing and we're wearing masks because we don't know if, because we're not following it, if we have it, we're asymptomatic and we spread it and someone else's grandma dies. Like that's very real, you know, but we have to think beyond ourselves. And that when we think about population health, because we might not be the person who gets hurt by it. Now, in terms of what this does for use rates, what we've seen, and I won't go through all this data, but essentially what this is illustrating, and you can look at the national level statistics yourself if you'd like to, is that the states that have followed this equation and increased access, normalized use, commercialized advertising, all of that have seen steady increases in use rates, particularly with adults. We're not seeing quite as quick of an uptick with kids, although there are some variables that show that, one, it is rising, but then two, also that it might be rising a lot more as they get older, essentially, because it's just become part of the fabric of their lives. Now, when they're not young teenagers anymore, they're more likely to use in college or as young adults and develop problems then. But absolutely, it bears it out. In Colorado, I think, depending on the data you're looking at, there's either been a 40 or 90% rise in adult use of marijuana since 2011, which is tremendous. And other states have not shown quite as steep of a jump, but they've also shown jumps. We were all very aware of this back when it was happening, the vaping epidemic. It predominantly centered around THC. We actually had the very first death in the world due to vaping here in Illinois. But the one thing I want to point out, we could talk about this for quite some time, but was that there was a lot of messaging around that, well, this is why we need to be legalizing THC products, because it makes them safe. But they didn't mention that actually 1 in 6 products that poisoned and killed people came out of a dispensary that was selling, at least state legal products. So this was something literally in Illinois as this was going on, where people were dying actively. The CDC and the Surgeon General said people should not be vaping THC for any reason. We had communities opting in to sell these very products to their communities and to their citizens. And it was one of these things that to me also seemed like a huge double standard where, like when, like if there's lettuce, from Salina, California, that's got E. coli. It's like you can't find lettuce anywhere. Like it's all pulled off the shelves. All the romaine is gone. But when people are literally dying from vaping, we're like full steam ahead with THC, with nicotine, virtually nothing happens to pull that back, which again, the drug world and the rest of the world oftentimes have very different standards. And we know that it impacts driving. So we could talk for, again, probably half an hour just on this alone. But the bottom line is that many different agencies have seen collisions, accidents go up in states that legalize marijuana. More people just simply are driving high and driving impaired. The reason for this is, there's a couple reasons for this. So a little bit of a loaded graph, I'm going to explain it. The blue and the green lines are smoking and vaping marijuana and what the concentration in nanograms per liter of THC is in your blood. And what you can see there is that for smoking and vaping, it spikes up very quickly when you consume it. And then it's actually basically all out of your blood or by around 4 hours. Now, one of the key differences between marijuana and alcohol is that alcohol, if it's in your blood, it's affecting you. And if it's not, It's not. Marijuana is very different. So marijuana is what's called a lipophilic substance. It loves fat. And your brain is like a big glob of fat, 70% fat. And so marijuana leaves your bloodstream very quickly and goes into your brain, whereas alcohol, it's being metabolized and excreted. Marijuana goes into your brain. And actually one of its metabolites also is impairing. So unlike alcohol, where it's just a base compound that impairs you. And so for people who are consuming it, we don't have like a breathalyzer for marijuana right now, not for the cops, not for us. So how do people know if they're too high to drive? We already know that kind of like judging and being like, yeah, I think I'm okay. It doesn't work for alcohol. It doesn't, it's not the best way to do it for marijuana either. And then actually edibles are a whole nother issue. So the black curve here, this is for edibles. And you'll notice there that it comes on much slower. It doesn't even hit the peak concentration in the blood until about 3 or 4 hours. And that's because it has to filter through the food in your stomach and also get absorbed by that lining. And then the surface area in your stomach is a lot less than the alveoli in your lungs. So it absorbs much more slowly. And so when it comes to edibles, particularly for people who aren't used to using THC products, is they might have one and be like, I'm not feeling what I want to feel. I'm going to have another. But the first one hadn't hit them yet. Or if they're having edibles that are made at home and they don't necessarily know how much THC is in them, it creates even additional problems. So there's big issues with driving. Another important graph here. You can see here that the pink line here is the THC concentration, again, over time when you're smoking or vaping. You can see there that very quick up and then down. But then if you look at their subjective high, that's the blue line, comes down slowly, but take a look right here. Here's the performance on the performance evaluation, and you can see that although that high of that line is going down consistently, the performance is flat. And that's a big issue, again, because people might not feel high, but their motor impairment isn't entirely back yet. We've actually seen some studies that show that actually up to 24 hours after using a THC product, people have some amount of impairment. Whether or not they're able to drive or not, yet to be seen. Not everyone metabolizes it the same way, but the fact that it's highly variable poses a huge issue. And it absolutely makes a difference, again, that's observable. This is finger to nose misses. So like a field sobriety test, the median of people with no marijuana in their system in this study was 0, and the median for those with any THC in their blood at all was 5. And what this says here in statistical speak is saying that it didn't matter in the sample whether or not people had over or under 5 nanograms per liter of THC in their blood. And that's been called the 0.08 of marijuana or of THC, saying like, well, that's what the cutoff should be. But truly, anybody who knows anything about the science will tell you it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing because it's lipophilic, because it goes into your mind within, your brain within 4 hours. But this, in our state included, was something that was brought up as saying, oh no, we know what the cutoff is. We know how to keep the road safe, despite the fact that this is just completely untrue. And it really is meaningless. One other point about driving here, the study came out about a year ago and looked at medical cannabis patients and whether or not they've been driving high. And what they found here, this was self-report, in the past 6 months, who were using it for pain rather, so we're using it daily, over 50% endorsed driving within 2 hours of using marijuana products. 50% endorsed driving while a little bit high, 21% endorsed driving while very high. And this is compared to a base rate in the country of 4%. So when people are using to excess frequently, right, getting very high, a certain percentage will continue to go about their lives, including going on the road. Now, what did they find in Colorado after they legalized? A huge spike in ED visits. They tripled, actually, for 2 reasons. The first I'm showing on this page. The second we'll talk about in the next. So the first is called cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. So this is when it's basically like a THC overdose, and it creates uncontrollable vomiting and pain in your abdomen. So you're basically screaming and vomiting for a very, very, very long time. And actually, we've seen this in our emergency departments even prior to legalization. I know right after the bill went through in June, I was in an ED at an emergency department meeting, and the doctors there were all upset by this and talking about like, so how are we going to handle this influx? Because it was something that they knew they were going to have to deal with. And this alone actually can kill you. I just pulled this off of USA Today. This was a 17-year-old who vomited himself to death. He died of dehydration due to cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Just one example. Clearly, it doesn't kill as many people as opioids. It doesn't. But to say that it's benign or harmless, never killed anybody, again, lowers perceived risk, but it sounds really nice, but it's not entirely true. The other reason for the uptick in ED visits are psychotic breaks. And this is another one of these things where whenever you bring this topic up, people who are staunch supporters of marijuana are like, oh, this is just like reefer madness stuff all over again, or moral outrage. When actually this is peer-reviewed, highly scientific literature that's been replicated at this point dozens of times, showing this link between marijuana use, that this point is becoming increasingly looking more like it is actually causal, not just like people who have psychotic disorders use. What this study found was published in Lancet Psychiatry, one of our most prestigious psychiatric journals, found that across 11 different sites in Europe, if you were using marijuana flower, you were 50% more likely to have a psychotic break. And if you're using the concentrate, 500% more likely. They found that, so 5 times. They found that 12% of cases of first episode psychosis could have been prevented across 11 cities if not for THC, including 30% in London and 50% in Amsterdam. So that's not nothing. One other just quick anecdote, or I guess I'll give you 2. One is, so in Linden Oaks Hospital, we have an adolescent psychiatric unit. At any point in time, we have about 2 to 5 kids in there for marijuana-induced psychosis. I was giving, a talk at a school, 3rd week of school this past school year. They said in the first 3 weeks, they'd already from school hospitalized 3 kids by ambulance for marijuana-induced psychotic breaks who had been vaping it at school and had a psychotic break. So this is not everybody, right? That would be ridiculous to say that this happens to everybody, but it's a lot more common with today's high potency product than people think it is. And again, it's these concentrates that are far and away the most risky, but even if you're just using the pot that's 7 times stronger than it used to be, that's a lot of THC to hit your brain with all at once. We also have seen, and this has also been replicated across different data sets, that if you are using recreational marijuana, you are more likely to develop other addictions. So this study was looking at the relationship between marijuana use and developing a new addiction to opioid painkillers. And they found that occasional use of recreational marijuana made folks 5 times more likely 3 years later to have developed an addiction to opioids. And if it was frequent or very frequent use, that odds ratio is 8 times higher than for no use. There was a study that was much ballyhooed about how people who were substituting marijuana in for opioids for pain, that those states had a reduction in opioid deaths. But what happened was that they only used data up through 2010. And when the exact same analysis was run on the exact same data set using data from 99 through 2017, they found that it completely reversed. And now states that had more people using marijuana had 23% more opioid fatalities when people were using medical marijuana for pain than states that did not. So again, this is why the research is so important. Now, at the municipal level, which is something that people are still making decisions about, we have a little bit less data, but what I have found was that this was one that found that youth use rates did go up in this area in Los Angeles County when they were exposed to more dispensaries, medical dispensaries, and advertisements for marijuana. Additionally, what we found is that the pot businesses tend to cluster in low-income minority areas. For sake of time, because I want to make sure we have time for some questions, I won't go through this in its entirety, but essentially, if you look at where those dots congregate, the darker counties there, and this is Denver. It's an interactive map if you want to look it up from the Denver Post, but the darker counties are the ones that are more affluent, where there's more money, and they have another overlay that shows the ethnic breakdown. And essentially, the vast majority of these businesses are targeting low-income minority neighborhoods. And that's honestly based on what I've seen in Chicago as well. We're seeing the same sorts of trends, just like the liquor stores do. This was another one from the municipal level that found that in Colorado, at the very least, they found that a crime increased in areas with dispensaries in every category except for murder and auto theft. And it's worth mentioning that other studies in other places have not found the same thing, but it's always a risk. So clearly this can happen. It's happened in some places. So the question is this something that you want to take a risk for in your community as well? So a couple other points that I want to talk about before we wrap things up. So does it matter what we endorse and promote as recreation to our youth? This is a model from NIDA of how addiction develops. And so to me, the answer absolutely is yes. But addiction essentially comes from a combination of nature and nurture, so biology, genes, the outside environment, getting the drug, interacts with brain mechanisms and leads to addiction. Now, how can we influence this model? Availability is one part, right? So is the drug available? And so what we've done here in Illinois is we've made it infinitely more available. Now someone's older sibling or someone with a fake ID can go and buy pot, whereas in the past, that was not the case. There was just a report in, I think it was Canada, where right now still, despite the fact that they've legalized it for over a year now, I think, only 30% of sales are legal because of the taxes. People are still buying off the black market all the time because it's less expensive. So it's one of those things where availability just went up. And then we can also influence there's peer influences, community attitude. So if we're norming getting high is what adults do for fun now, then that's something kids are always watching, right? They're always watching what we're doing, what we're messaging down to them. So when we're sending them the message that getting high is fine, getting high is okay, they're going to pick up on that. And again, sometimes people will say, well, what about alcohol? And I'll say, well, what about alcohol? Again, it causes huge problems in our society. 88,000 deaths a year, half of all rapes, a bunch of car accidents, half of all assaults. Like, it is absolutely, I am someone, I absolutely, from time to time, I like a good beer. I will absolutely, and I would give it up in a heartbeat if it could never exist. If I could save all those lives and all that pain and suffering, I would never, ever, if we as a human race, in my opinion, we'd be better off without it. And so just because it's already here and we're suffering doesn't mean that we should do something else that causes us to suffer more because we think that it's a lesser suffering in some way. Like that logic really doesn't, again, make sense. We found that 1 in 4 12th graders from the Monitoring the Future study in 2018 said that they would use pot or use more if it were legalized in their state. Again, not for them, but just legalized in general. And so again, when we think about where is this going and what does it message to kids, it really matters. For the sake of time, I'm not going to break this down all the way, but what we found is that for young people, and your brain is not done developing until the age of 25, using THC products can quite literally cause permanent structural changes to your brain, particularly in the areas of the hippocampus, which is associated with learning and memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which is what's associated with your personality, as well as executive function, which are things like motivation, abstract thought, being able to synthesize large ideas, task shift effectively. Truly permanent neurological changes, both in terms of if you are using the high potency products, those are the riskiest for this. But then also what this line here is looking at is the duration that people use it. And this is not just a one-off study. What you're looking at right here is actually a meta-analysis of dozens of studies. So this is just very solid data on it hitting the brain. And this is just locally. This was something that happened at a summer festival in Buffalo Grove. Recently, the medical marijuana dispensary was set up next to the trampoline park and was actually giving out their swag to kids. And when they had a chance to respond to this in the paper, they basically didn't apologize. They said, well, we happen to do it mostly for adults, but kids get benefit from this too. And they didn't even apologize for literally, and now these guys are a recreational dispensary as well, by the way. So they're now selling for people who just want to get high for fun. So I will talk about this, and again, I know we're all low on time, so I'll try to keep this brief so that there's time for questions. Another thing that I hear is that there's a debate about it being a gateway drug, and this is another aspect where there actually is no debate about this, and I want to explain why. So first, we have correlations, which are not causation, but correlations that show for decades that there's been association between using marijuana and other drugs. And this one here, basically the blue lines in this graph are no marijuana kids. The orange ones are yes marijuana. And you can see they're 10 times higher chance they're going to use another illicit drug. We already saw this graph talking about projections 3 years over time. And then this is more national level data that found that 92% of people who use heroin have used marijuana first. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone who uses marijuana is going to use heroin, right? That would, again, be ridiculous, but that's not how risk works. It has to do with the chances that it is going to happen to you, because you ask just about anyone who used heroin, they have used marijuana first. Now, here's why this happens and why, again, we call it a gateway drug. If you have a kid and their friend walks up to them, and the kid's never used a drug in their life, and the friend walks up and says, hey, I've got some heroin. You want to tie off and inject it? The kid would be like, no, I don't. And so what's going on? That's a very strange request. And the reason for that is that the perceived risk of that is very high, right? That's a tough sell. No one's going to say yes to that. That's like step 5. Instead, what happens is that their peer group is all vaping. So now they're vaping too. And at some point someone brings like a pod with THC, or maybe it's just weed. And they're like, oh, it doesn't matter. You know, it's just weed. It's just a plan. It's legal anyway. Everybody's doing it. I'm going to do it. So now they're doing it. They identify as someone who gets high for fun and who gets high socially. And they're hanging out with people who also get high for fun. And that means that at some point they are more likely to be at a party in some location where someone's got some cocaine, some bars of Xanax, some Xanax pills, whatever it is, and then, or a hallucinogen, and then they try that, and now there's someone who experiments with it. Maybe at some point someone's got a Norco, got some hydrocodone, an opioid. And they try that, they really like that. And that hooks them, because opioids can hook you very quickly. And then they're moving up into stronger pills. Then eventually, because pills are more expensive, they start getting heroin because it's a lot less expensive, because it's less safe, but you snort it first oftentimes because that's more palatable than injecting. And then you're injecting heroin. You don't just start at the end. So the bottom line of it is you cannot get to step 5 unless you take step 1, step 2, you have to work your way up. If you never take step 1, you're never going to get to step 5. Bottom line, that's what a gateway means. It means you're literally opening a gateway to drug progression. It does not mean that you are going to. But the people who never start down that path virtually never make it to the stuff at the very end of it. So again, it's a question about risk. And I think sometimes people confuse risk and determinism. And they think that those are the same thing, and they're not. So a couple last things, and then we'll take questions. And again, I apologize that this last part is going to be a little bit rushed. But I want to talk a little bit about how marijuana is marketed. So this is from our currently medical dispensary in Naperville. And if you look at the names of these products, 707 Headband, Alien Rock Candy, Bio Jesus, Blue Cheese, Durban Poison, Flow. These are supposed to be medical products, and they've been named this way for years. Platinum Girl Scout Cookie, OG18, I don't know if you guys know what OG stands for, but that's Original Gangster. Strawberry Cough, it says known for a sweet smell. I can make even the most seasoned consumer cough. People might be like, why would I want my medicine to make me cough? It's because the phrase in marijuana using culture is, if you don't cough, you don't get off. If you don't cough, you don't get high. So that's, again, speaking current marijuana slang. And even if you look at OG18, they're advertising that it won the High Times Cannabis Cup in 09 and 010. So this is not marketed at 65-year-old women with MS. You know what I'm saying? Marketing is always on purpose, right? You market at the audience you want to attract. And this is what the medical marijuana industry had been doing for years, even before legalization. Here's another one of their products, again, from a marijuana dispensary called Green Crack. And you can see that the THC content in this is 27%. So again, you can go into the dispensary for whatever you have, and you could walk out with 2.5 ounces of green crack. And that was what was going on and what we had in our state before it was even recreationalized. We're going to, again, go quickly through this, but essentially it's really important that we work with the safety protocols we have in place. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with thalidomide, but this was a drug essentially that was used in Europe and caused a huge number of birth defects, essentially. Kids born with either these miniature limbs or without arms entirely. Again, I won't go into this right now for sake of time, but essentially there was a study that came out about 2 years ago now that found that 70% of marijuana dispensaries in Denver recommended pot to first trimester pregnant women for their morning sickness, even though we know that it's really bad for the fetus in a number of ways. And there are just some really shocking quotes from that study that marijuana dispensaries told them. And even again, from this dispensary that we have in Naperville, I just want to read this to you. So this is one of their concentrates. The term Rick Simpson oil, RSO, refers to extremely potent decarboxylated extracts produced from strong striated indica strains, which have THC levels in the 90% range. This harmless, non-addictive, natural medication can be used with great success to cure or control cancer, MS, pain, diabetes, arthritis, asthma, infections, inflammations, blood pressure, depression, sleeping problems, and just about any other medical issues that one can imagine. So remember, you are walking in there and you can buy what you want. And these are the people who are guiding you towards your product. Like, this is quite literally what snake oil was described as, and why we have, and this is, last I checked, within a week on their website still. Like, this is how they're marketing this product. So again, this is the industry that we've enabled and grown. So to conclude, because again, I want to make sure we have at least a minute for questions. Marijuana is an addictive substance. Assertions otherwise are either anecdotal or the outcome of public misinformation efforts. So just please be very firm about that when you're speaking to others. Greater population exposure plus that lower perceived risk leads to greater use and more negative consequences. If a certain percentage of people in the population are going to have an issue and you raise the absolute value of people using the product, more people are going to have an issue. And that's what we're looking at here. Whatever our goals were behind policy change, creating big marijuana was not necessary. A lot of people don't realize you can reform drug laws in terms of, like, you could expunge convictions. You could even legalize possession without legalizing sale. You don't have to create an industry. And numerous national and state level organizations were opposed to this, virtually all in medical and public health and safety. And then also actually the NAACP. And that surprises some people, but actually they were staunchly against it because they understand the way you raise up and restore communities is not by selling pot to your neighbors. Like, that is actually not the way that you raise up a community, is by getting them high and intoxicated. That's actually a way of keeping them down. So as a final note, I don't know if these things look familiar, but this is where cigarettes started. They allied themselves with health and medicine and doctors. And here they're saying avoid that future shadow. You can see that the shadows have jowls. They're basically saying nicotine's a stimulant, so use it to not gain weight as you age. Now scientific evidence on effects of smoking. He's probably not smiling because he's giving himself throat and lung cancer, but that's the ad, and that's where this started. And we're kind of doing this again. So our perspective really can change over time. We used to sell cocaine off the shelf and heroin as well. We thought that was a good idea. We used to smoke on airplanes, even though we're like literally lighting something on fire in a tin can 30,000 feet over the earth with recirculated air. But we did it. And we, even now, this is right off the CDC's website, every state there that's white does not ban smoking indoors by law in even one type of venue or establishment, despite the fact, again, that we know it causes cancer. So these industries and these practices can leave their tendrils all over society and be causing damage for decades and decades. So I always just recommend, let's be as thoughtful as we can. Let's really try to have our eyes open as we go into this and make sure that we're perpetuating fact and truth about this, rather than what might be in the best interests of people who are trying to make money, and honestly make money at our expense. So thank you guys so much for your time and attention. And I think we've got just a couple minutes. If you have a couple questions, again, please feel free to reach out to me over email or LinkedIn if you'd like to connect.
Dr. Weiner, thank you so much. I'm sure I'm joining everyone in just saying that this is an incredible presentation. I think we do have time for one or two questions. One of our attendees was wondering, with regards to IQ, you had mentioned the impact of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Do you know specifically for marijuana use prior to age 25, the impact that may have on IQ?
So the data on that specific metric has been mixed. Some studies found that if you're using it consistently since you're young, it can be up to 6 to 8 points of IQ loss. Others have not found that. What does seem to be the case is that there are permanent cognitive changes that go along with those brain structure changes that don't necessarily come back. And we have a lot of evidence to support that. But the specific IQ metric is something where we've had evidence going both ways. And as a quick aside on that as well, for a lot of these things, it's using marijuana is never a good thing. It's never like, oh, it helps. It's like either, yes, it's definitely bad, or there's mixed data and you're probably taking a risk if you do it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And how would you, someone asked, how would you condense this when you're talking to a middle school student? What do you usually tell them? How do you explain this at their level?
So what I tend to do, and I do assemblies as well, where I take this and I present it a bit differently. What I do, so data doesn't necessarily impact them because there's some idea that like these negative things won't happen to me, or they'll believe what they're seeing on social media instead. Like who am I to tell them? So what I do is I first actually start with the marketing. And I actually go into in greater detail what marketing to kids looks like and young people, and what marketing to adults and older adults looks like. And I give examples of other products. And I talk about the industry. And then I show specifically how the industry is marketing to them for vaping and for marijuana. And basically, I start by saying they're playing you. They think they can fool you, and it's been working, and they're taking advantage of you. They're trying to because you're a kid. And that gets a rise out of them. They care about that. You talk to them about like brain structural changes, they're like, well, whatever. But you say like someone's trying to take advantage of you because you're a kid, they're like, oh, hell no. You know what I mean? And they get up about. So first you start with that and you get them like really like what's going on here. And then I add in some information because I think that's important too. And I usually end with the idea of you're going to have to make your own choices. You're going to be in plenty of situations where you're going to have access to this. You get to decide. I'm not going to judge you, but you got to know what's really going on here and make up your own mind. So that's usually how I do it with middle and high schoolers.
That's great. That seems really effective. Well, we are at the top of the hour, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you, Dr. Weiner, so much for today's presentation. Thank you, everyone, for attending. As you leave today, there will be a survey that'll pop up on your screen. We'd love your feedback just so we can continue to improve our programs. And if you live locally, we would love to invite you to serve with Stand Strong. There will be information on that survey about how to do that too. Dr. Weiner, again, thank you so much for your expertise, for your insights, research, phenomenal presentation. To everyone else, and including Dr. Weiner, we wish you health and wellness in this season. Thank you all and have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.